Coming up this week,
most people have never heard of Guyana. Many think it's in Africa, but Venezuelans know their CIA World Factbook inside out. They've long claimed that its western regions are rightfully theirs, and now that the Guyanese have struck oil, the Maduro regime wants to take those areas by conquest. The question isn't, can Venezuela, population 30 million, knock over Guyana, population 790,000? With the West presently preoccupied on two other continents, it's who's going to stop them?
This week, the world's biggest oil producers announced they'd be sharply cutting back on production, and the oil price fell. There's something screwy going on in the market, but who exactly has the power to manipulate the world's biggest, most internationalized market?
Finally, this week in Middle East Corner, we've got yet another round of damaged ships.
But first, Team South America.
This week, we have rumblings that another war might be on the cards to add to the one in the Donbass and the one in Israel-Palestine. The Guyanese territory of Essequibo, which is 160,000 square kilometers. It's actually 2/3 of Guyana's territory, although it only accounts for less than a quarter of their population, is a disputed territory between Venezuela and Guyana. And it's actually been disputed since Venezuela gained independence from Spain in 1821. As long ago as a century and a quarter ago, in 1899, an international arbitration tribunal found in Guyana's favor, but Venezuela has always rejected the 1899 Paris Tribunal because Venezuela wasn't represented at the tribunal. Guyana at the time was a British colony, and Britain had two representatives, whereas Venezuela was represented by two Americans. Instead, Venezuela has emphasized a 1966 agreement with Britain, which at the time was still the colonial overlord of Guyana, which agreed to settle the dispute through mediation. But this is all very old. I mean, 1966 was 60 years ago, and the International Tribunal was 124. So what's changed now? What's brought us ever closer to war? The answer to that is that in 2015, a huge oil deposit was discovered in the maritime territory of Guyana, and specifically in what would be the maritime territory of Essequibo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Essequibo. And essentially, ExxonMobil has led a consortium to exploit the deposit, and they're already pumping 400,000 barrels a day from this deposit. Guyana's GDP has tripled in size because of this in just the 3 years between 2020 and 2022. That gives you an idea of the scale of this. The problem is that ExxonMobil's involvement, and it's not just them, there are two Chinese oil companies involved as well, lest people think that this is an all-American affair. But ExxonMobil's majority position in this consortium is drawing in the US military. And, obviously one of the key roles of the US military is to protect US interests abroad. And quite often that means it's trading interests, it's business interests, it's concessions to exploit natural resources. And so the US military is being drawn ever closer in. In 2020, the two countries signed an agreement on defense. And indeed, as recently as a couple of weeks ago, the US First Security Force Assistance Brigade and the Guyana Defense Force met, furthered their military cooperation, made agreements to continue that military cooperation. Obviously, because Venezuela disputes this territory, it feels rather chagrined to have the US having a military presence there. So this week, Venezuela held a referendum that asked several questions related to the Essequibo affair, essentially saying, do you, the Venezuelan people, agree with us that Essequibo is ours and that we shouldn't allow Guyana to administer it and have U.S. military in this region. And the referendum returned a 95% result in favor of the Venezuelan government's position. The Venezuelan government has also complained to the United Nations about the U.S. Cooperating with Guyana and stationing troops in Guyana and patrolling Guyanese waters. So increasingly, it looks as though the Venezuelans, now that not only is there oil and not only is oil being pumped, but the U.S. military is getting involved in the region. They're increasingly they're showing an increasing amount of urgency, shall we say, to wrest back the Essequibo region from Guyana. And of course, in the current febrile global environment, the febrile global atmosphere, shall we say, there are concerns that this could indeed lead to war, which is the last thing I think anybody wants. But certainly it seems yet another global flashpoint to add to the myriad of global flashpoints that there already is.
Yeah, right. I guess I'm old enough to remember when the Bolivarian revolutionary state would say things like "no blood for oil," but I guess that's out the window when the oil is off your shore, and there's an awful lot of it. It's a more arcane situation than I think we're used to on Multipolarity. I mean, much of what you've outlined there, I had no idea of the history. I'm sure many listeners don't either. So it might be helpful to just get a very broad kind of CIA Factbook kind of overview of what we're dealing with here.
I mean, we get all our facts from the CIA, Philip, just so our listeners know. So
that's right. It's my favorite factbook. So Venezuela, probably people are more familiar with. It's got a population of close to 30 million people. Guyana has a population of 790,000 people. So it's not only a small country, it's a tiny country. And I think that is kind of reflected in its military strength. So the Venezuelan army, I'm just going to note the motto here. It's Forger of Liberties. Doesn't include anything about oil. Its size is 115,000 people, which is actually not an enormous army for such a large country, but 115,000 people, no less. The Guyana army is, they don't even have proper figures on it, but it looks like they might have 4,600 personnel, maybe 3,000 in reserve. And when you look at the list of equipment, it's really no comparison, as you can imagine, with those relative sizes. Perhaps Guyana's got very rich in the past 3 years, but it hasn't had time to spend its wealth on guns. It basically has a bunch of small arms, from what I can tell, maybe some mortars or something. I mean, I'm looking through a list of their vehicles, and they actually list pickup trucks as one of their military vehicles, so that's never a good look. The Venezuelan army, again, not really comparable to a country of its size in, say, the Middle East, but it's got 81 AMX 30V French main battle tanks. It's got 92 T-72s, Russian Soviet tanks. Got a bunch of light tanks from France. It's even got some British light tanks. Not sure where they got them. Got some infantry fighting vehicles, mainly Russian in origin. It looks like they've been using some of their oil money since the Great Revolution to buy up Russian military gear, in the great revolutionary tradition of buying up Russian military gear when a revolution takes place. They also have a lot of French stuff. Some of it looks pretty recent, I'd say, armored personnel carriers and stuff. Some pretty sophisticated surface-to-air missiles. Looks like they're probably stepping up. I mean, they have an S-300 system from Russia. They've 2 of them. So I guess they were buying, even though their army isn't enormous relative to their population, I guess the breakdown of what they were buying looks like they were preparing for a potential intervention by America, would be my guess. And of course, that was a realistic fear in the early 2000s when it was put on the axis of evil list, along with North Korea and Iran and so on. And there was a soft commitment by the Bush administration to go after all these countries. So, I mean, what I'd take from that is that you've got a tiny, teeny, teeny country with a pretty much non-existent military and a very large country, actually, or at least a large country. I'd say large, actually, large, not very large. With a sizable enough military, not hugely impressive for its size, but pretty well equipped, I think would be fair to say. So, I mean, I think you have a better sense of the situation than me, but it looks to me like, if Venezuela want to spread the Great Revolution to part of Guyana, with nothing to do with seizing their oil reserves, I mean, they can do it in a heartbeat, right?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's particularly clear because, as far as I understand, topographically, that area of Guyana, and it is 2/3 of the entire country. It's not a small area. I mean, it's in old money about 62,000 square miles. I mean, that's a fair old chunk of real estate, and it's also a jungle, a lot of it, as far as I understand. So it doesn't seem like the most forgiving of areas to easily invade. Certainly, those British light tanks aren't going to find it easy going. They're not going to be surging across the North European plain or across the North African desert or anything like that. I think the more important point to consider here, before we consider the outcome of war, because if they do want to seize the oil, they've got to seize the maritime territory as well, which is another matter indeed, especially given that it's on the southern shores of the Caribbean, which the US will see as the core of US strategic interests in the Caribbean. I think the more important point to consider here is it's a kind of a classic example of how disputes like this can end up in war. We've seen one over the last couple of years of a similar nature, although widely unacknowledged, among the media. But this one, similarly, it's not simply a case, I think, of Venezuela wanting oil. I mean, the Venezuelans have loads of oil themselves. It's not like it's not like they're resource poor and they're desperately trying to get their mucky paws on some oil. I think the more important point here is that they've long seen the region as Venezuela. I mean, they've claimed it since 1821. And since then, they've been trying to get it back, essentially, from Guyana. They rejected the 1899 Paris Tribunal, and they still hold out hope for reconciliation or mediation through the 1966 treaty or agreement with Britain. The problem is, of course, as I said earlier on, now that there is oil and now that US companies are exploiting it, and now, frankly, that the US and the Western world needs more oil, given they have excluded, to a certain degree, legally, de jure, if not de facto, Russian oil from the Western system. The US needs to defend those interests, which is, perfectly understandable. Equally understandable, though, is that Venezuela would see, the big fist of the US military suddenly, gaining a footprint, gaining a foothold in the region and defending the region as a clear threat to their ability to, or their leverage to secure territory that they see as their own through mediation. What chance do they have now that, one of the most powerful corporations in the world, backed by the power of the US military, is exploiting oil in that territory, and exploiting oil, as far as I understand, under extremely favorable terms to ExxonMobil. Slightly less favorable to Guyana, apparently. I'm not expert enough to know this. So the Venezuelans probably say, well, what chance do we have? And the more the US gets involved, the more the US deepens its military cooperation with Guyana, the less and less chance we've ever got to deal with this. On the other side of the ledger, because the US has sanctioned Venezuela really heavily for 15 years or however long ago it was that the Bolivarian Revolution took root, what does Venezuela really have to lose? Like, oh, they can, the only way they can really lose, as you say, given the military balance of power, is if the US comes down on the side of Guyana. They can't really lose by further sanctions. I mean, what further sanctions can they impose? It's like the North Koreans are allegedly supplying weapons to the Russians. Well, maybe we could punish the North Koreans by sanctioning them. Well, no, the sanctions are already there. So on one side, you've got increasing concern that the US is essentially precluding any mediation that would give Venezuela any hope of reclaiming territory that for over 200 years it has seen as its own. On the other side of the ledger, you've got the fact that, really, apart from actually physically getting involved itself, there's very little that the US can do in terms of economic sanctions to dissuade the Venezuelans. And finally, of course, the Venezuelans might be looking at this and saying, the US has spent 2 years getting involved on the Pontic step on Europe's eastern approaches, sending loads of weaponry, getting its, scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of what they can send without affecting America's own ability to fight a war. Then they've had the Israeli situation, which they've had to undertake in really quite significant emergency munitions supplies to Israel as well. Well, maybe if we're going to do this and we want to minimize the risks of US interference, maybe this would be the ideal time, especially with the US distracted about China. Maybe the US would cut its losses in this sense. All of these things are working together, and I think it's a great example of the sort of things that can flare up when countries, when the leading powers within the region, the powers who use the kind of the big fist to settle disputes in their region, whether it be, say, Russia in the Caucasus with Armenia and Azerbaijan, or whether it be in this case the United States in the South Caribbean area. When the cat's away, the mice tend to play. And now that the US has been getting involved in all sorts of conflicts that are strategically non-core, shall we say, now we start getting the potential for small conflicts in a very much core region. And the potential for that is increased because it might be seen that the US has weakened itself somewhat, or at least weakened its ability to want to go fight a small war against a country like Venezuela.
I think you're absolutely right about the distraction, the overstretching of the American military might. I mean, that is clearly top of the table here. On the sanctions, actually, I think some recent news would shine a slightly different interpretation on that. Actually, quite quietly, in mid-October, the US gave basically a 6-month moratorium on the sanctions. It eased them. The reason it was giving was because the Biden administration reached a deal with the Maduro's regime, I guess they'd call it, and on electoral reforms. Now, were real electoral reforms put in place in Venezuela? Seriously doubtful. But the US Treasury Department issued a license authorizing Venezuela, which has been really heavily sanctioned since the Trump administration in 2019, to produce and export oil to its chosen markets for the next 6 months without limitation. Now, why did they really do this? It probably wasn't about electoral reform. It was actually, I think, because the US had lost control over the global oil market with the situation around Saudi Arabia that we've talked about quite a lot. And they saw it was a very multipolar thing to do, actually, on the part of the Biden administration. They basically looked at Venezuela and said, okay, we've had our differences in the past, but the Venezuelan state probably doesn't actually pose a security risk to the United States in any meaningful sense. And so, we'll just reach this deal and we'll import some of this Venezuelan oil. Well, I think the news reports from that I'm looking at were from October 18th. So less than 2 months later, Venezuela are considering invading a country next door. So obviously, what we can take from that is Venezuela feels like, to use a pun, perhaps, that they really have the United States over a barrel. They not only see the United States overstretched, but they know that the US is pretty desperate for their oil right now. And if if the US want to intervene on the Guyana situation, that oil probably won't flow. So, really interesting situation. It's a sort of in a sense, when you zoom back, it's like the perfect multipolarity story.
And don't forget, not only will the Venezuelan oil not flow in theory, but the Guyanese oil won't flow either if there's a war. So it really does seem that there's a big incentive at the moment to settle this somehow through mediation. But this referendum, and in fact, the International Court has said that has condemned the Venezuelans for doing this. So we are already seeing escalations here, and it is something that can, affect. Okay, it's not like cutting off Russia from the world, or it's not like it would be cutting off the Saudis or whoever, but. Nobody wants to see yet more oil taken out of the global system. We've already got Iran. We've already had Venezuela. There are already disruptions because of the conflict in Ukraine and the various Western responses to that. And now we perhaps have, Venezuela and Guyana as well. That's a really shaky position indeed. And, I don't think anybody wants that. So, as I say, it might be the Maduro government, seeing a great opportunity to push further for some kind of mediation. But it might also be them panicking a little bit that outside forces are getting involved that are now tipping the balance against Venezuela. Who knows? But as you say, it is the perfect multipolar story. It is also a story of what happens when leading power fails to pick and choose where it intervenes, fails to take account of what happens, and when its power starts to recede somewhat. Whenever power recedes, outside, internal forces within the footprint of that former power start competing over what's left. And I think that this is yet another example of conflicts of the like we will probably see over the coming decade or so as the world shifts from a unipolar into a multipolar world system. Printing oil.
I think it's worth kind of prefacing the commentary intro here, just for people who don't know about the oil market. I'll give kind of a personal anecdote. When I first started working in finance, I was trying to figure out what determined prices in various markets. And I remember asking a pretty seasoned watcher of the oil markets, what should I look at? How should I view the oil markets? And I expected him to come back and say, well, you need to look at the supply and demand for oil, and you need to do this, this, and this. But he didn't say that. He said to me, just listen to what the Saudis are doing. Whatever the Saudis are doing is probably going to happen. Not precisely, but directionally. And I have found that that's been pretty good advice. When the Saudis say that they're going to push the price of oil up, they usually end up pushing the price of oil up. And when they say that it's going down, it usually goes down. Now, outside of recessions are obviously an exogenous event, as economists would say. And they shock the market in such a way that big producers like Saudi Arabia and Russia lose control. Big swing producers, I should say. And just very quickly on that, a swing producer is important because Saudi Arabia, if you compare Saudi Arabian production to the United States, the United States, I believe, actually does produce more. But the United States produces this oil, and it's an enormous market that absorbs the oil. Saudi Arabia is an enormous oil producer, but it's actually, in effect, a kind of small country that doesn't use that much oil. And in that sense, it's the swing producer, and it tends to impact the price. So the economics of it makes sense. So why does that matter? Well, I'd seen that the price of oil was behaving a little bit funny for a while. And a news story crossed my eye a few weeks ago on the price of oil. And in it, the Saudi energy minister, who I believe is the brother-in-law of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, said in the article that the oil price was completely out of whack and that it wasn't behaving normally, and that he thought that speculators were driving the price down. Now, if you've ever worked in financial markets, people who blame speculators for everything. When a trade isn't going their way or anything like that, they'll usually blame the nefarious speculator. And often this is just, as the kids will call it, a cope. But occasionally it's true, and I thought I knew enough about the Saudi energy minister to know that he's a pretty serious and measured guy, and not prone to hysterics. That's kind of why they probably chose him as the energy minister. And so I kept an eye on the market, and it did seem like it was behaving strange because basically OPEC Plus, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, who are the two largest members, are saying that they're cutting oil massively, and they were originally saying that they were setting a price target of up to $100 a barrel, and nothing. So that's the supply side. On the demand side, nothing particularly interesting was happening. This is a whole other debate, but if listeners will just take it at reasonable face value, I'm not particularly bullish on many Western economies right now. They have a lot of problems, and I think they will go into recession in the coming year or so, maybe two. But there is no sign of imminent recession, like immediate in the next quarter recession, except maybe in the United Kingdom and maybe in Germany. And some of the Central European countries. But even in those ones, they're very initial signals. The UK could already be in recession. But the United States is not in recession. It's just had a record, 20-year record quarter of growth driven by the Inflation Reduction Act. China is meeting its growth targets. Good PMI numbers came out on the day of recording currently. So the supply gets cut by OPEC in the face of, I would say, fairly stable demand, at least for now. And yet the price is falling. And as the Saudi energy minister says, this is very strange. So I've been watching this for a while. I commented on it a few times on Twitter. And then I realized that there was a Saudi energy meeting coming up. At the time of recording, it was last week on Thursday. And it was actually delayed. It was supposed to be on Sunday. But I said, I'm going to watch that meeting and I'm going to see what happens. And the market, the media was saying that OPEC were basically going to fall into a tiffle and disagree with each other and not get any production cuts done. And I have my reasons to doubt that narrative. Anyway, they come out and they make additional cuts. They massively increase the cuts that they're doing. Now, knowing the expectations baked in, right? And knowing the supply and demand situation, it should have been pretty obvious at that stage that all of the narratives around the meeting were wrong, and the price of oil should have gone up because there was a larger than expected supply cut. But lo and behold, the price went through the floor. It was very, very strange, and it did so immediately after the meeting. And the media really were left scrambling for narratives. They do have some narratives. I think they're pretty silly. They're about credibility, this usual kind of, navel gazing by the media, like, oh, you didn't communicate it properly because we're communicators and that's what we do. Communication means nothing in the oil markets. It's how much black stuff comes out of the ground and how much black stuff needs to be bought. That's all that matters. So then a day later, to finish this slightly long story, the Bloomberg comes out with a very interesting piece on algorithmic trading in the oil market. Bloomberg present data from a private company that tracks this, showing that algorithmic trading in the US oil market spiked in 2023. And a separate Bloomberg article showed that just prior to the meeting, the OPEC meeting, hedge funds put on a load of short positions. So what you would glean from this, and perhaps we can discuss it more, is that the hedge funds and the algorithm traders are following each other. That's the most likely explanation. The algorithmic traders are going into the market in enormous volumes, and the hedge funds are doing short sales of oil futures in order to hammer down that short so that it triggers the algorithms which follow trends, and then it collapses even more. You can almost think of it as like a short trade that's like punching through algorithmic resistances and driving the price of oil down. But it's very strange. It's very strange, and perhaps we can talk about it more, but it will have real economic impacts because mispricing oil is a pretty dangerous game.
I'm often a little bit skeptical about market movements. I often think that, whether it's equities or bonds or certainly commodities, I'm almost skeptical that day to day, week to week, or even month to month movements have much relation to fundamentals. And when they do, it tends to be sudden snapbacks or bounces or whatever, as they suddenly realize that they've mispriced something. I tend to think it's a fool's errand trying to divine from futures markets or equities markets, exactly the health of an underlying economy or an underlying commodity. I had a little bit of a look at this, and two things sprung to mind. The first was that, somebody outside the OPEC Plus organization, i.e., the US, might be pumping a hell of a lot more oil out of the ground. My second assumption was that, people were taking short positions, and it was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy in that, the more short positions were undertaken, the more the price was falling. Just to let people know, a short is, when people essentially bet on the value of something falling. So if you short Apple shares, for example, or if you short the British pound, for example, you're essentially betting on that, the shares in Apple or shares in or the British pound itself falling in value. And because of the mechanism that short contracts work, that can sometimes in and of itself force the price down. And as people short a market, other people might think, aha, everybody thinks it's going to fall, I should start betting against, or I should sell, or whatever. So on the first one, on more pumping, I will say that the US is pumping almost record amounts of oil, despite the Biden administration's rhetoric about going green. They are in fact pumping more oil than ever. I think it's something like 13.5 million barrels a day at the moment. Which is higher than the previous peak, which itself represented a pretty big surge after the shale revolution. So there's that potentially. I know it's been said before that because of the nature of shale oil drilling and fracking, it's something that you can turn off and on a little bit more easily than traditional pumping, despite it being more expensive to do. And therefore, it essentially makes it easier to be a swing producer. And because the US is pumping so much these days, a lot of people see the US rather than the Saudis as the swing producer these days. So perhaps there's that. The other point is, I checked on the NYMEX, the major index through which oil futures are traded. And the net short positions are indeed, pretty high at the moment. The net short positions are 171% higher than they were this time last year. There's been a significant increase in net short positions. So, yeah, they also might be driving the market as well. At the same time, though, it is still highly unusual that both Russia and Saudi Arabia could, in lockstep, announce production cuts and the price of oil continue falling outside a recession. Obviously, if there's a recession, demand for oil declines, and therefore the price of oil declines given stable supply. But we're not in recession. The US economy is, in fact, growing robustly. Europe is, of course, stagnating. China isn't seeing the kind of, Lollapalooza growth that it experienced, pre-2021, but it is still growing at 5.5% a year GDP. So, the demand for oil should be still pretty high, one would have thought. Russia and Saudi Arabia have announced cuts, and yet the price of oil is falling? Is it the algorithms? Is it the net short positions? Is it just that the US is pumping? I don't know. But it would seem that the bottom line is this. If the Saudis and the Russians are determined to see oil hit $100 a barrel and stay there, then they can just keep cutting production until it damn well gets there. And eventually they're going to, one would imagine, they're going to, find victory against short sellers or against, short-term algorithmic trading platforms. They probably even can overwhelm US production as well. So, you'll know better than me, Philip, but, while I'm skeptical about playing too much into this, if the market suddenly realizes, they're just going to cut and cut and cut and cut, my guess is that there would be a really serious bounce back in the price of oil indeed. The oil market can be really violent in its price swings, right?
Yeah, I'd say on the American production first. On the supply side, the oil market, because it's basically controlled by a cartel, isn't actually really rocket science. It's actually basic arithmetic. U.S. production numbers are up. You're correct, and the latest number we have from November, it's November numbers. I think it's September, October, is that U.S. production is up 224,000 barrels a day. But OPEC are committing to cutting 2.2 million, 10 times that. And not only is that kind of the empirical fact of the supply currently, but it also gives a sense of the magnitude. They can easily cut 10 times more than the US can produce at the margin. And this goes some way to showing why the US, I would argue, is just simply not a swing producer. It's a large producer with a large domestic market that can occasionally turn up the volume and extract harder to extract oil. But the reality is the US is in not a desperate state for energy or anything, but the Biden administration has been trying desperately to flood the market. It's emptied its strategic petroleum reserves, which has become a hot button political topic in the United States. So I really don't think it's the US, and I don't think the US has the supply capacity to overwhelm the market. And actually, it ties into something we discussed in the last segment, which is that, the US went in October, all hands on deck, and made a deal with Venezuela. That's how things were looking in the oil market at the time. That's why this decline in prices has been so unusual. I just say two further things. First of all, the Saudis have picked a fight with the press recently, the Western financial press. They were annoyed at what they thought to be misreporting, and they didn't allow the press in. So that's actually soured relationships with the press and may actually account for a lot of negative headlines that are currently taking place. Bloomberg did an article with the energy minister, which I watched, and it looked to me like the energy minister was trying to reestablish good relations with the press. But the energy minister was very dismissive of the whole thing. He said that the whole thing was an embarrassment and the market was mispricing, and it was going to be taught a harsh lesson. He seemed pretty confident, and as you say, they can keep cutting if they want. The last thing, and I guess the most important, is why does it matter? First of all, people would say, who cares? Markets bounce around all the time. And then maybe secondly, people would say, well, it's good that the price of oil is coming down. Don't we want the price of oil to come down? And if the speculators can play Robin Hood and get the price of oil down for the regular guy in the street, then why is that a bad thing? Well, it's a bad thing if it's mispriced, because if oil is mispriced on the downside, substantially mispriced, and we could be talking about up to $20 a barrel here, and it's currently sitting at about 74, $15, $20 a barrel. There could be that much mispricing at the moment. And what that'll do is it'll encourage people to party as if there's no tomorrow. It'll encourage people to buy oil at a rate that's not commensurate with the supply. And of course, what will then happen is as the increased demand hits the reduced supply, at a certain point, the market will go, oh no, there isn't as much oil here as we were pricing in. And then, as you've alluded to, the price will shoot up. And that could prove to be very, very disruptive. And I'm not going to put a timeline on that. What we've said is, again, to use a pun, quite speculative, but I think there's something here that's worth watching. Wouldn't want to put a timeline on it, but how long can paper markets beat out the physical reality of the oil market? I don't think we're talking months here. Let's just put it that way. But even a couple of weeks of overconsumption could make a serious long-term difference in the actual price of oil, if we want to put it that way.
GTA Jihadi. So once again, we're going to discuss happenings in Israel. Sadly, this week, we're once again talking about ships. And as we suggested last week, escalation has happened, not to war, not to bringing outside power in, but we have definitely stepped up a rung on the escalation ladder. Last week, as people will remember, we spoke about the US getting involved in wresting back a ship that the Houthis had taken over. Both Philip and I suggested that this hinted that indeed escalation could happen. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened this week. Two Israeli-linked ships in the Red Sea were attacked by Houthi missiles. A US Navy Arleigh Burke-class missile destroyer engaged these missiles, or perhaps drones. Details are sketchy at the moment. And in fact destroyed some. Early reports suggested that the US destroyer itself came under attack, but later reports said that it simply defended the two ships. There have been no reports of damage to the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. However, my fear is, and I'm sure yours too, Philip Pilkington, is how long can this go on before there is damage to an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer? Not necessarily saying that a Houthi drone could sink one or missile, although that is possible. But if one does manage to leak through the ship's defense systems, which is, of course, possible, as anybody who's followed any kind of naval action in any war in the last, 30, 40 years will tell you it is very much possible. See the Falklands, see the Black Sea, see the Eastern Mediterranean. What will happen if US service personnel on the destroyer are killed? Touch wood, they won't be, but what will happen if they will be? What happens if a destroyer is damaged at all or even sunk? Surely at that stage, the pressure on the Biden administration will become overwhelming, and they'll simply have to intervene in this conflict.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, week by week, it just keeps escalating. We've kind of alluded to this before, that I don't think that the Houthis or anybody else wants to immediately escalate to the maximum volume. At the start of the war, I think everyone who was watching it thought, is this the big one? Are Hezbollah just going to go in the north and the whole thing's going to kick off in this incredibly ugly way? Not unlike what we saw less than 2 years ago in Ukraine. That hasn't proved to be the case, and it's clearly it's become clear now that the escalations are strategic in nature, but that doesn't mean that they can't get out of hand. That's the whole kind of point of strategic escalation in a way. And every week, or it's not even every week now, it's every couple of days, these strikes on naval targets get a little bit spicier. 1 week it's just the Houthis landing on a commercial vessel and taking it over. The next week, we have a similar action, the US Navy intervening and missiles being shot across the bow of the ship as a warning. And now we've had a slightly even more escalatory move by the Houthis. So I think people who understand these things will get the message. This is going to keep escalating until some sort of resolution is found in the Middle Eastern conflict.
It is a perplexing world because we are fresh from a huge victory.